Angeles County. I have a dual position at both of these institutions, and I am currently leading Project Phoenix, which I know many of you are involved in, which is wonderful. We could not do our research without community scientists like yourselves. Today, I want to tell you a little bit more about my research as well as Project Phoenix. And more broadly, how I view engaging the public as really the key to unraveling the mystery of how birds respond to wildfire smoke in the American West. This is a brief outline of our talk today. First, we'll talk about how wildfire smoke is an increasing stressor in ecosystems in the American West and let you know a little bit more about what the review of the literature really has to say about this topic. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about the work that I did up at the University of Washington, thinking about smoke and how smoke influences our detection of birds in the field. And finally, we will come back to Project Phoenix, investigating bird responses to smoke. I don't have to tell the folks on this Zoom call that birds face myriad threats, from climate change to habitat loss to invasive species to overexploitation. And air pollution is also a known risk to birds, yet air quality has been long overlooked in conservation biology and wildlife management. And I find this really funny. I find it odd that we have known for so long that birds are vulnerable to air pollution and considered air pollution to be a real risk to birds, and yet there's just not that much in the literature about how wild birds are impacted by air pollution. So I say we've known that birds are vulnerable to air pollution for a long time. How do we know that? Well, actually, going back to the early 1900s and even as late as the 1960s in some parts of the world, coal miners would bring canaries down into mines with them to help monitor levels of noxious gases. And this practice was valuable because the canaries would succumb to sickness due to exposure to toxic gases well before the human miners did. And so these folks were able to use canaries literally as like an air sensor underground. And this has led to the use of the colloquial phrase canary in the coal mine to indicate an early warning signal of some future danger. So going back over 100 years, we knew anecdotally and we knew in practice that birds are more vulnerable to air pollution than we are. And to this day, we know that birds are really valuable sentinels for our environment. If the birds are healthy, we're healthy. And yet, we just don't know that much about how air pollution is impacting our feathered friends. So where does this inherent vulnerability come from? I could geek out about this for the entire talk, so I'll be brief, but we can come back to this in the Q&A if there are other physiology nerds on the call. So this GIF shows human respiration on the top and avian respiration on the bottom. And you can see that in the top graphic of human respiration, the lungs expand and contract with each breath. So I want everybody to practice with me for a second. We're going to breathe in and out. And when we take a deep breath, we can feel that our lungs are expanding and contracting. They're opening and closing. And this is how we tend to think all animals breathe, but it's really not how birds breathe at all. Avian respiration is shown in that bottom graphic, and this crisscrossed section in the middle are the avian lungs. And avian lungs, unlike ours, are actually rigid. They don't expand and contract. They don't move upon the inspiration and expiration. Birds have these lungs that sit in their chest cavities and are surrounded by a system of air sacs. And this system of air sacs actually pushes fresh oxygenated into their lungs in a one-directional, a unidirectional flow. And this makes birds incredibly efficient at respiration. In addition, they have a very thin blood gas barrier. The distance between their air capillaries and their blood capillaries is just very, very, very thin. And that helps to diffuse oxygen from the air into the bloodstream. And furthermore, these air and blood capillaries are crisscrossed in cross-current gas exchange, and that makes the uptake of oxygen even more efficient than it otherwise would be. So birds have a unidirectional airflow, thin blood gas barrier, and cross-current gas exchange. And these are all mechanisms that make them very, very good at breathing. And that makes sense because birds have to fly, and it takes a lot of oxygen to power flight. And so over centuries and centuries, birds have evolved this highly efficient respiration to increase their oxygen uptake and power flight. But that comes with this consequence of being vulnerable to the other stuff that's in the air too, because if they're really good at picking up oxygen, they're really good at picking up the toxic stuff. They also seem to lack some of the mechanisms that humans and other mammals have to clear particles from their airways. For example, we have these cells called macrophages in our respiratory system that basically function as janitorial cells, and they clean up debris. And some research has suggested that birds do not have macrophages in nearly the same density or numbers that we do. They also have a cough-like action, but it's unclear how good that would be at clearing particulates, especially in really long-necked birds. So whether we're talking about gaseous air pollutants or particulate air pollutants like that we find in wildfire smoke, birds are just inherently more vulnerable than we are to air pollution. So how much do we know about how air pollution is impacting birds? As part of my master's thesis, which I led at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I led a comprehensive literature review on this topic, and we found that there really hasn't been that much work done looking at the effects of inhalation exposure to air pollution in birds. That said, we do see from the limited research that does exist that there are clear impacts on health and behavior, and that there could be demographic consequences of these responses. A lot of what we know actually comes from veterinary medicine and case studies from really caring for domestic animals, whether those are pet birds or poultry, livestock. And what I'm really interested in is, do these findings hold up when we bring that knowledge and those hypotheses into the field and consider impacts of air pollution on wild birds? This review, which is available open access, so anybody on this call can go ahead and download it themselves. The citation is in the bottom right-hand corner. Outlined a lot of the knowledge gaps that I hope to explore in my postdoc and beyond. What we know is that air pollution is impacting birds, but again, we just don't know a lot about what this means for wild free-living birds. We don't know which pollutants would be most relevant, what thresholds exist in terms of when we expect to observe health effects. We're not sure if there are behavioral responses that birds might exhibit that allow them to better cope with exposure to air pollution. And we really need to be thinking about how birds of a wider range of species and across a wider range of ecosystems are responding, because what some birds might be able to cope with might not hold up in an entirely different system. So there's a lot of work to be done in this space. I am especially interested in one pollutant in particular. I mentioned that we need to do more to learn about how different types of air pollutants impact birds. And fine particulate matter is one of many pollutants we could study, but it is of great importance for public health. And so there's a lot of really great data available on PM 2.5, which makes it a good place to start. So fine particulate matter is all suspended liquid and solid particles in the air that are smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter. So that's smaller than the width of a human hair. This is the really, really fine stuff that when we breathe, we can actually find this very deeply embedded in our respiratory system. There are both biogenic or natural and anthropogenic or human-derived sources of PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 includes wind-blown dust and particulates in smoke. Those would be biogenic sources, as well as the particulates from, say, vehicle exhaust. That would be an example of an anthropogenic source of this pollutant. And whether we're talking about biogenic or anthropogenic PM 2.5, both types are considered risks to public health. They've been linked to cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, and premature mortality. In fact, around the world, more than 4 million premature deaths each year are attributed to this pollutant. But as I mentioned, when we're thinking about where to start and thinking about air pollution impacts on birds, this is a valuable pollutant because there's just so much data due to the links to public health. Another reason why I'm really interested in PM 2.5 is because for a long time, PM 2.5 pollution was improving in the United States, but recently it has gotten worse. So this plot shows the difference from a baseline and how much PM 2.5 we're seeing across the US on average from 2009 to 2018. And you can see that around 2016, fine particulate pollution started to increase. And this is partly due to changes in policy in the US, but it is primarily due to wildfires. So as we are seeing more and more fire on the landscape, we're seeing more and more smoke, and that smoke is driving PM 2.5 and actually reversing some of the improvements in air quality that we saw after passing the Clean Air Act in 1970, which is remarkable because the Clean Air Act led to rapid improvement in air quality in urban and rural areas across the United States. So to see wildfires cause a decline and a reversal in that progress is really quite stunning. I don't have to tell folks on this call just how intense these recent smoke events have been. We've all lived through them. This is a satellite image taken on September 9th, 2020 during an unprecedented fire and smoke event that impacted the entire West Coast. And you can see from space just this massive plume of smoke stretching from fires across California, Oregon, Washington, and up into Canada. And smoke was blown quite literally hundreds of miles out to sea. So all people and wildlife living in this area were impacted by smoke during this time. Just to drive this home, here are some images of skylines in cities from Los Angeles to Seattle impacted by smoke events over the last few years. And on the right, you can see a plot from a paper by Childs et al. Published in 2022, showing the difference in the number of days of bad air quality that folks are experiencing now compared to 2006 to 2010. And you can see that there has been an 11,000 times increase in the number of days above 200 micrograms of per cubic meter of PM 2.5. And this just shows how much more we're all experiencing smoke. So I hope I've convinced you all that smoke is a big deal for people and wildlife, and that we should really think more about how wildfire smoke is impacting birds because they're so vulnerable to air pollution. But what do we know about how smoke is impacting our feathered friends? I've said that we don't know that much about air pollution generally. Is there anything we know about smoke specifically? What do we know about other taxa? I led a literature review on this topic as part of my PhD at the University of Washington. I believe I have the citation available in an upcoming slide. That paper is also available open access, so anybody on this call should be able to download and read it. Our review found that smoke has been linked to acute, meaning short-term, and chronic or long-term health outcomes across taxa, including carbon monoxide poisoning, thermal and chemical damage to lung tissue, oxidative stress, immunosuppression, and respiratory and cardiovascular illness. And while perhaps these effects have not been documented in wild birds specifically, there really isn't any reason to suspect that birds would not be vulnerable to these health effects, just given how birds breathe and the similarities that they share with the taxa that these effects have been observed in. We also learned that the literature suggests that wildfire smoke may be prompting several different types of behavioral responses in animals. For example, some animals seem to lower their activity when it is smoky. They move less and they vocalize less. Much of this knowledge comes from research out of Southeast Asia, looking at how orangutans have responded to smoke, as well as the vocal rates of calling taxa in that part of the world. We also receive a lot of anecdotal evidence, a lot of observations from birders just like you, suggesting that the skies just feel emptier and the soundscapes feel quieter when it's smoky. That doesn't necessarily mean that birds are less active, but it is something I hear a lot from birders. Animals might also exhibit these different fire avoidance or energy conserving behaviors. And this research comes out of looking at mammalian responses to smoke in Australia, and whether or not animals can actually use smoke as a trigger to know that fire is coming. And it seems like some mammals are actually able to arouse themselves from torpor, increase their activity in response to smoke. And this could be a way of them getting out of the way of the danger of a fire event. Some, however, also seem to do the opposite, where they hunker down and they're in torpor for longer as a result of smoke exposure. And this could be a way for them to conserve their energy, knowing that the fire is going to come through and remove resources that they otherwise would depend on. There are also animals like insects that exhibit these pyrophilous or fire-loving behaviors in response to smoke. For example, there are insects that lay their eggs in fire-killed trees, and they actually use the scent and heat of smoke to navigate toward those resources. And there could be insectivorous bats and birds that are attracted to those insects and are therefore maybe drawn into smoky areas following that food resource. So there's a lot of interesting hypotheses that emerged from this literature review. And we put all of these health and behavioral responses that have been documented in the literature into this conceptual model, showing how wildfire smoke impacts at the individual level could ultimately scale up to influence survival, reproductive success, and growth and development. Those are the vital rates that drive population level changes. And so we're really hoping that over time we can better understand how wildfire smoke directly relates to those three parameters for survival, reproductive success, and growth and development, because that's what determines whether or not a population increases or decreases. And that seems to be what folks really want to know, and that information would help us make decisions from a management perspective about how to best protect birds and limit any negative impact of wildfire smoke on bird populations. The citation for this review is here on the right, and I'd be happy to send PDFs of both of the papers that I've referenced so far out to your organization if that's of interest. So I was very curious thinking about what we know and don't know about how birds are responding to smoke, whether or not these anecdotes of what we're seeing in the field as birders when it's smoky can be found in community science data. Like, do we actually see that there is an impact of smoke on our observations of birds? Do our observations of birds change when it's smoky? Folks say that that's true, but smoke events are so overwhelming and challenging for us as people. No one feels good when it's smoky, that it could be very easy for us to assume that something's happening to birds that's not really there. And so as part of my PhD, I really dug into this topic. So here you can see a NASA worldview image of some of the smoke events that was included in this study. Our hypothesis was that wildfire smoke is leading to behavioral changes in birds that may or may not be attributed to underlying health effects, and that ultimately these behavioral changes affected the presence or the detection of birds. So birds might leave an area that is smoky. They might be intrigued by an area that is smoky. The way that they respond to smoke behaviorally could influence their presence. But behavioral changes might be more subtle rather than determining whether birds are there or not. Smoke might actually change a bird's behavior in a way that makes them easier or harder to observe in the field. For example, if birds are lowering their activity, if they're singing less, they'd be harder to detect. But if they're aggravated and moving about or singing more, they might be easier to detect. So there are a number of behavioral changes we might expect to observe. These would ultimately influence presence and detection of avifauna, and therefore our overall probability of observing birds. So in this study, we asked, how does wildfire smoke, with PM 2.5 being a marker of wildfire smoke, influence our probability of observing birds? And you'll notice that I outlined detection in red, and that is because I need to remind myself to point out that there is a confounding variable here, which is that, as I mentioned before, no one feels good when it's smoky. So we feel crummy, we're sad and upset, and we also can't see as far. So we don't feel well, and our vision has been impaired. So that is a confounding thing to think about here, and we'll come back to that in the results. So for this study, I focused on community science data available for the state of Washington in eBird. I don't need to tell hardcore birders how cool eBird is, but we can circle back to this program if folks are unfamiliar. So for this program, folks submit checklists of birds that they see and or hear in the field. And for this particular study, we pulled data from 62,908 surveys or eBird checklists submitted by nearly 5,000 observers in the state of Washington. Those checklists are marked as gray dots on this map. And then we also pulled in data from 71 different air quality monitors run by the Environmental Protection Agency, which are shown as black triangles. We focused on the 2015 to 2018 fire seasons for this analysis. So those are the years that this checklist group represents. We knew that we needed to account for differences in habitat. There are lots of different habitats available to birds across the state of Washington, so that data comes from the National Land Cover Database. And smoke isn't the only atmospheric variable that might influence our detection of birds. We also cared about whether the temperature was warm or cool and whether it was rainy or snowy or dry. And so we pulled in data on the daily mean air temperature and daily accumulated precipitation from the North American Regional Reanalysis. So putting all this data together, we modeled the probability of observing 71 different species using generalized linear mixed models. I won't get into the statistics here unless folks have specific questions, but what this approach allowed us to do is basically look at the probability of observing birds. That's a reflection of both whether or not a bird is available to be detected, whether it is present in a given place at a given time, as well as our probability that we'll detect it. Because we all know that sometimes there are birds around that we don't see and hear, even if we know they're there. So we can't tease out those two processes, but we were able to look at whether the probability of observing birds was related to a number of different factors, including PM 2.5 as our marker of wildfire smoke. We also considered weather, habitat, year, day of year, and time of day. This allowed us to account for all of the other reasons why we might observe birds differently from one day to the next, while then layering PM 2.5 on top of that. eBirders are all very different, and some go out for short surveys, some go out for long surveys. And so we really wanted to make sure that we accounted for differences in effort too, because the longer we're out observing birds, the more likely we are to detect various species. So our models do account for survey duration and distance traveled. And then we also used a statistical approach called a random effect to account for observer bias, because some of us have more experience than others, and we wanted to account for that in our models as well. So with all of this in mind, what did we find? We found that PM 2.5 influenced the probability of observing 37% of our study species, which was a much greater proportion than we expected. This relationship was negative for 16 species and positive for 10. And that's really important because, as I mentioned earlier, there is this confounding variable of us and how smoke influences our own ability to detect birds. And there's really no reason to think that we would suddenly be better at birding when it's smoky. If we feel crummy, if we feel sick, if we can't see as far, if we're blue and sad because it's smoky, we're not going to be better at birding. And so this positive effect here, this idea that there are some birds that we are actually observing more readily as the smoke intensifies, suggests that birds are in fact changing their behavior as a result of smoke exposure. So let's look into these results a little bit more specifically. This plot shows the predicted probability of observing birds as a function of the daily mean concentration of PM 2.5, which again is our marker of wildfire smoke, for those species for which we observed a negative effect. So this shows how the probability of observing birds changes with smoke for the birds that are less likely to be seen as smoke gets worse, seen or heard, since eBird checklists represent the birds that we detect by sight or by sound. So this list includes a lot of different types of birds. But one thing that we noticed is that there are a lot of raptors on this list. That could be because raptors are often spotted at a distance and our vision is often impaired during smoke events, so we might not see them as readily. But it could also be that these are larger birds with bigger home ranges and birds that are actually able to better avoid and evade smoke. There are also some really teeny tiny birds on this list, like the savanna sparrow and the marsh wren. And it's possible that maybe as birds are either unable to see those predator species, or as those predator species leave an area, they become more willing to be out and active. These are hypotheses. We were unable to test those with just this data, but they lead to some really interesting ideas that we're exploring in studies right now. This is the same plot, but showing the relationship between the probability of observing birds and smoke for those species that are more likely to be detected as smoke intensifies. And what I thought was really interesting is that our warblers made this list. And even if that effect was not statistically significant, all warblers exhibited this relationship. So there do seem to be some relationships, some similarities in taxa. And these relationships are fairly simple, that we're just looking at detection as a function of smoke, but they tell us that birds are responding to smoke in interesting and different ways. And that is really the foundation for Project Phoenix. which I'll get to in a moment. So our conclusions from this work is that wildfire smoke does in fact influence the presence, availability, or perceptibility of birds, and these responses to smoke are likely species specific, but we need to do a lot more to tease out what's going on. If you're interested in that paper, this citation is here, and this paper is also open access. I'm very big on publishing open access because so much of my work is inspired by stories from birders and from anecdotes that folks share with me, and I really want to give back to all of those community scientists that are putting in the hard work and make sure that the research is easy to access at the end of the day. So now we will talk about Project Phoenix, and let me check the time. Oh, perfect. We're zooming. It's going to be great. We'll have lots of time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll come back to them, or you can save them for the end. I know that we're going over a lot. We've talked about how wildfire smoke is an increasing stressor to ecosystems in the American West and really globally. And we've also we've dived into how smoke is impacting birds and other taxa, and thought about how smoke is influencing our observations of birds in the field. And now we're going to put that all together and talk about next steps. Where are we going in this research, and how can you get involved? So Project Phoenix is a new community science program that I'm leading out of UCLA and in collaboration with the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. We launched last year in 2023, but we were just focused on California. And this year we've expanded to include Washington and Oregon. Last year, our volunteers represented 175 zip codes across the state and included roughly equal proportions of novice, beginner, and expert birders, which is very cool. And I think our total number of volunteers was 375. I could be wrong about that. I know it was over 350. This year we have nearly 450 people engaged, so we're getting bigger and bigger, which is very cool. The goal of this program is to collect bird observations during the fire season. And a lot of volunteers have reached out to ask, well, why can't we just use existing eBird data? Which is a great question. I just went through this really interesting study that told us a lot about how wildfire smoke could be impacting birds and used eBird data. So why wasn't that sufficient? Well, we really need more surveys before and after smoke events in the same places at generally the same times of day and days of the week. And we need folks to be putting in similar effort. While we can control for effort in our analyses using tricks like including fixed effects of distance traveled and survey duration in our models, like I did with this last study that I just mentioned, it would really be better if folks were putting in consistent effort from the get-go. This is one of the first studies to intentionally anticipate and study smoke impacts. A lot of what we know about how birds and other animals are responding to smoke is opportunistic. We happened to be out during a time that was smoky. We happened to be collecting data on birds or other wildlife, and we were able to put something together. And that's great. It's amazing that researchers are able to pivot and leverage those opportunistic moments to learn more about this stressor. But our studies are so much stronger if we can think ahead and anticipate the stressor that before it hits and design a study accordingly. Our program also allows us to get to know our volunteers and have these great dialogues with our community scientists, as well as collect fine-scale habitat data, such as the availability of bird feeders and bird baths at these monitoring sites that would just not ever be available in a public database. So our goal is to collect data on the presence and abundance of birds during the fire season in Washington, Oregon, and California. That's our study area. And evaluate the impact of wildfire smoke on bird distributions. We want to know how smoke is shifting where birds are in space and time. And more specifically, and I'm very excited about this, we want to consider if these responses are varying across habitats. So are birds changing where they are in response to smoke? And is habitat part of the equation? And more specifically, are bird feeders and bird baths part of the equation? I hear a lot from birders about how the appearance or behavior of birds in their backyard at their feeders and baths is different when it's smoky. Some folks write in and say, I see no birds at my feeders or my bird baths. And then I have other folks who write in and say, actually, I'm seeing so many birds congregate here. It's as if they're starving, it's as if they're thirsty. And both of those things could be true, just depending on where folks are in relation to the smoke event, what time of year it is, what resources birds are looking for. And so I think better understanding how birds might be using feeders, bird baths, habitats more generally during smoke could give us a better understanding of what we need to protect to help them through these very extreme disturbances. So our hypotheses are that wildfire smoke is leading to these underlying health effects. It's making birds feel sick, or it's prompting birds to engage in these smoke avoidance behaviors. And this is leading to an energy deficit. It takes a lot of work to mount an immune response to battle some underlying health effect. It takes a lot of work to shift your entire strategy for a given day to avoid smoke. That burns through calories. And so birds might be upping their use of feeders as they're moving through areas where there are people to put out bird feeders, and increasing use of those resources. Wildfire smoke is also highly likely to make birds feel thirsty or at least want to drink more water. That's at least that at least makes sense to me, anecdotally, just based on my own experience in smoke events. And then we also know that smoke is very drying. Wildfire smoke also dirties birds' feathers, and birds have to keep their feathers clean in order to ensure proper thermal regulation. So both of these effects could increase their water need and therefore increase their use of bird baths. So neither of these hypotheses has been explored in the literature, and we're really excited to use the data we're collecting in Project Phoenix to dig into this. So in this program, volunteers choose their own monitoring sites. We encourage folks to pick places that are easily accessible and personally meaningful. And then folks are asked to conduct a 10-minute point count once a week, noting all of the birds that they see and or hear, and add that data to an eBird checklist. Folks also take a one-time online survey to register their sites and tell us more about the resources available to birds at those locations, including availability of bird feeders and bird baths. We are focused on boosting engagement in underserved communities. It is our goal to be inclusive and welcoming of communities traditionally underrepresented in birding and community science. And to that end, we spend a lot of time thinking about ways to encourage and welcome and support beginner birders. As I said, we're really proud that we have roughly even proportions of beginner and expert birders as part of our program. And we think that birding really is a superpower and a great way to get folks to care more about birds and conservation, and also just to make sure that we're getting good bird observations in lots of different kinds of places, including places that maybe expert birders wouldn't go birding in. There are a lot of resources available to beginner birds on our website, and we also hosted virtual office hours this summer to support our beginner birders. So putting this all together, what is the conservation relevance of this work? What are you contributing to by signing up and participating in Project Phoenix? So if smoke impacts an ecosystem, how do birds respond? I believe that birds are going to exhibit one of three strategies. They're either going to stay, they're going to shift, or they're going to go. They're either going to hang out and change their behavior in a way that allows them to cope with the smoke as best they can. Maybe they'll reduce their movement or reduce their vocalization. They might shift their use of resources. They might say, I don't really like hanging out in this part of the canopy. I'm going to go to the forest floor, or I am going to seek this food resource because my caloric intake is different. And then there might be some birds that leave. And we don't know how birds are going to respond, but I expect that they exhibit one of these three responses. And our data in Project Phoenix will help us better understand how birds are responding to smoke, where they are going, and if they are staying, how are they changing their use of resources? My goal for this study and for the other work that I'm leading here at UCLA is to identify the places and resources that serve as smoke refugia. We want to coin that term in the literature and really make it clear what is it that birds are seeking when it is smoky. And we want to determine if these responses mediate their exposure. If a bird stays, its exposure will be whatever the smoke is at that spot. but maybe if they shift their activity, if they shift their use of resources, they might mitigate some of that exposure. Certainly, if they leave, their exposure would be different. So how species respond in the moment could really make a difference in terms of the overall health effect that they experience. We also want to consider how functional traits relate to these strategies. So can we predict based on the traits that birds have, which of these strategies they might exhibit? We are also looking into whether the exposure to smoke is prompting birds to use bird feeders and bird baths differently. And by characterizing shifts in bird activity at feeders and bird baths, we'll really be able to develop intervention strategies. So if we don't find that birds are using bird feeders or bird baths more, then that would suggest that protecting smoke refugia is a better use of our limited time and money. But if we find that bird feeders and bird baths are actually really helpful, that birds are really looking for that clean water source when it's smoky, if I can say that with confidence, then it becomes very easy to say, well, my data, our evidence suggests that this is something that we could all do to help birds, this short-term intervention of just providing water. I don't have any data that suggests that that's true, but hopefully through Project Phoenix, we'll be able to find out. So how can you help? You can sign up to volunteer with Project Phoenix. That would be great. We're still collecting data through the end of November. You can sign up anytime. You can also help by promoting us on your website and social media. You can encourage everyone you know, staff here at Mendocino Coast Audubon, members, other volunteers who you work with, friends, family to help us out. You can establish a monitoring site where you work or at your community center. And if you are a manager, you can encourage your team to participate and maybe even allow them to take 10, 15 minutes each day to conduct their surveys. In return, what we're offering organizations is promotion of their own programs, events, and other initiatives, meetings just like this to share our science, workshops on birding and species ID, events on diverse career pathways and STEM for youth groups, and so much more. We have so many ideas on our website. We're hosting raffles and art giveaways and all sorts of other things for folks who sign up. So with that, I want to say a huge thank you to all of my co-authors, mentors, community scientists, just like the folks on this call, as well as the entire Project Phoenix team, especially Caitlin O'Neill, who is a recent graduate from UCLA and currently works as our communications lead. So with that, I would love to take any questions you have about my research, about this framework that I've presented for thinking about smoke impacts on birds, as well as Project Phoenix specifically. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can actually see the Zoom chat to see if anyone has already posted a question, but we can come back to slides if that would be helpful. So thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to get into the Q&A.
Fantastic presentation, Dr. Sanderfoot. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I don't see
Yeah, I don't
any
see much
questions in the chat.
It might be that I know in my head questions were coming faster than I could write them down. So
I hear you. I hear you. Well, it looks like we've got 18 people on this call and like 30 to 40 minutes. So everyone has time to ask a question.
a couple of things that occurred to me. One was, have you had a chance at all to look into the historical incidents of wildfire smoke? My understanding is that you go back 100 years or so, and in California at least, it was an annual event, dense wildfire smoke blanketing pretty much the state. And there are some interesting early accounts of people coming out to see the wonders of California and unable to see much.
Yeah.
And I think there's been some work on wildfire frequency and severity, in the prehistoric period, and suggested that this isn't something birds are just now having to deal with. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So certainly I think that historic data could be useful. The trick here is that we need to find a creative way to get an estimate for smoke pollution in a time before air quality monitors. So
Right.
it's one thing to say, here are some interesting observations of birds, or here is some cool banding data from several decades ago that was collected when it was smoky. it's another thing to say, well, how smoky was it? And so I am leading several different interdisciplinary collaborations right now to better understand how atmospheric scientists collect data on air quality, and creating data products, including data from ground-based sensors, satellite instruments, and chemical transport models, and making them available to ecologists so that we can all look at the data that we have available and link that with existing resources on air pollution estimates. The problem is that we can only go back so far with air pollution data. And so a lot of the data that we have on birds from, the early 1900s, we'll never be able to link that to really good estimates of air pollution. We have a better understanding of stable pollutants like carbon going back several decades, but the air pollution that we're interested in when we think about health effects are short-lived air pollutants that come and go and interact with tissue in a way that does damage. And those air pollutants are harder to find records for in, say, ice cores and some of the other sources of air pollution data for the pollutants that we worry about when we're talking about what's driving climate change. That said, I'm leading this very cool collaboration at the Natural History Museum in which we are using museum specimens to look at historic records of soot. And this has been done one other time in the Chicago area at the Natural History Museum in Chicago. One of my colleagues, Dr. Shane Dubay, looked at how soot deposition on specimens from the Industrial Revolution to present varied, and they were able to actually, in that study, relate the soot deposition to known records of emissions and show that birds are actually really excellent records of what was in the air. And so we're hoping to apply that to the archives at the Natural History Museum here in LA, and then take it one step further and actually extract any soot that's on those bird specimens and analyze it chemically to determine how much of it was from wildfires. And if we can do that, that means every museum has a record of how much smoke was in the air at the time that birds were collected. And we could roll that out all over the world and then suddenly be able to relate bird observations to air pollution records. But we have to establish that first. And no one's done it before. So it might take us, a little while, but we'll figure it
out. So many things to do. A new field of science. Before I get to other questions, that just brought up another one. Then you mentioned the physiology of bird breathing and how it makes them susceptible. Have you, this might be too big of a question. It might be another hour-long presentation, but what are the physiological, do you see physical effects in the birds, like in those specimens or in birds that have been collected and necropsied? Do you see an effect of small particulates in there?
So I don't know of any studies that have collected birds that we know were exposed to smoke, wildfire smoke specifically, and then conducted a necropsy, except for two related case studies. During the 2020 Southwest avian mortality event, which some folks might not be familiar with, so by way of background, during those really extreme fires of 2020 along the West Coast, there were hundreds of birds that were found dead in New Mexico and in the Southwest. And it was unclear at the time if that was related to this snap freeze that was in the area, which impacted the availability of insects, which is a really important source of fuel for the birds that were migrating south at that time, or if it was related to smoke. And a lot of the specimens were collected and necropsied, and it was determined that there was not evidence of smoke inhalation in their lungs. However, that doesn't rule out the possibility that smoke had something to do with the mortality event, because we also know that birds adjust their migratory routes in response to smoke. And we know that because one of my colleagues, Dr. Corey Overton at the United States Geological Survey, was able to relate the movements of 4 migratory geese during the 2020 smoke events to estimates of smoke pollution. And he and his team showed that these birds went wildly off course or stopped migration altogether for a couple days, basically waiting out the smoke pollution. So if birds are able to or are forced to adjust to smoke in real time, if they're changing their behavioral patterns, then that could lead to a caloric deficit very quickly because migration is timed perfectly. So birds have enough fuel to make that journey. If they have to make any deviations, they might not be successful. And so one hypothesis that my colleagues and I have is, okay, well, maybe birds actually didn't inhale the smoke and that wasn't what killed them, but maybe they had to make these very big changes to try to get around the smoke. And by the time they got to New Mexico, there was nothing to refuel because of this cold snap. And unfortunately, they passed away. Those are hypotheses that we're exploring in a number of different ways. I also know that there are some ongoing experiments at UC Riverside led by Dr. Chris Clark looking at how hummingbirds in captivity that are exposed to smoke in a laboratory setting might be responding to that pollutant, and they will be doing some histology on tissues collected. So those are the only two examples that I can think of. There are studies looking at lung tissue for other pollutants, and certainly there are case studies from veterinary medicine that show effects on the lungs. But I don't know of any example of somebody, say, going out and collecting songbirds during a smoke event and then looking for damage.
Yeah, it'd be a tricky thing to do. Yeah. So I've got one here from Jeanette Boyer, who points out that we here on the Mendocino coast are in an area where people actually, this is a smoke refuge. People come here to get better air quality when the fires are making air quality terrible in inland California. And so we get, smoke refugees here. So would that make us great bird surveyors during smoke season or not? How much
Yeah,
would that kind of effect have on our participation in your project?
sure. And I also saw that Doug had a question. So Doug, we'll
Yeah,
get to you next. So if I understand the question correctly, the idea is if an area is either one that's known to be smoky or one that's known to have good air quality, how would that affect whether or not a birder's observations are valuable? Yes.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Because our, we tend to have better air quality even when
mhm,
when the smoke is drifting through.
sure. So really, anybody who lives in this study area, regardless of their community's exposure to smoke, should feel welcome to participate and encouraged to participate. We really need the data from everywhere, and there's a few reasons for that. First, we need to be able to compare bird observations in places that are smoky to places that aren't smoky in order to understand the effect of smoke. We also need to be able to compare bird observations in the same place before, during, and after a smoke event. And we want to know where birds go when it's smoky. And so if one of the hypotheses is that birds are leaving a place that's smoky to go someplace with good air quality, I'm not going to know that unless there are people who are in both places letting me know who's in their backyard. So for all of those reasons, no matter where you are, you're contributing something valuable if you sign up.
Very good. Doug.
Yeah, I was in Australia this spring, and one of the coolest things I saw was a flock of black kites um, in a smoke of a fire.
Yeah.
And, so since they're in smoke and right next to highways where the lizards are all crossing the highway and they're grabbing all the things, plus the black kites actually pick up burning sticks and set fires. So there, I think one of the kites I saw had a burning stick, and I didn't believe the uh, bus driver when he said, "Yeah, they do that." And I went and looked it up, and I guess black kites plus other kites do that too. Can actually spread fire, which is so far beyond just using a tool. They can think ahead to set a fire, grab a burning stick, go set a fire, and then get the lizards that run out. Just have
Yeah.
So anyway, there's probably a lot of dead kites who are used to being in smoke along the roadsides, and so somebody could probably collect you. This was up in the Darwin area. There is a bird observatory up there, and they might be able to collect you birds that have been in smoke. And
Yeah.
since they do it right near the highway.
Yeah. Yeah, and so for those who are unfamiliar with this idea that Doug has shared, so there are birds, as I mentioned earlier, that might be drawn to smoke because there are resources available in smoky areas that are not available in places where there isn't smoke. So, for example, smoke signals fire, and birds of prey might know that there are lots of teeny tiny mammals and amphibians and reptiles that are fleeing the flames. And so to them, smoke signals fire, signals food, and they might be attracted to smoke. And there is one study looking at behavior in raptors in the US, I think in a tall grass prairie system. I want to say the last name is Havik, but I can look that up if you folks are interested. And they saw that there was an influx of raptors at this burn site. And the raptors, even here outside of Australia, which is where we tend to think about these things happening, were attracted to the smoke. There are also birds that feed on insects that are likely to lay eggs in fire-killed trees or have to lay their eggs in fire-killed trees. And so they might be drawn to the smoke, knowing that that's where the insects are. And then there are these kites in Australia that anecdotally appear to set fire because it promotes these resources. I think it's really hard to know what's going on in the head of a bird or any other animal. So it's hard to know like how intentional, like how really intentional is it? Like, are they thinking this is fire? I know that if I set a fire, this resource will appear. Or is it a learned behavior? It's fascinating to me. They clearly do it. They clearly do it. Doug has seen it. They clearly do it. But like how much they're thinking ahead is really fascinating to me and totally outside of my expertise because I'm not a bird psychologist. But I think that's like a really interesting thing. So certainly that would be a resource. Also, some people say, well, these seem like good things. Like it seems like these birds are using their environment in interesting ways. So the smoke isn't going to be a problem. Birds have figured it out. Those birds live in places where they're used to fire, where fire is a natural disturbance. It's a frequent part of their everyday life. That is not the same thing as smoke inundating communities all over the West Coast. It's not the same thing as experiencing hazardous air quality day in and day out for weeks. So there's different scales for these smoke events, and the smoke that we're seeing now is very different than the smoke that we've seen for centuries. And it also impacts places that do not burn or do not typically burn or do not burn at these crazy fire intervals that we're seeing now. So it's a really interesting question. Also, just because a bird is in smoke and they're using smoke doesn't mean that it's not experiencing the health effects, right? It means that over the millennia time scale of evolution, those birds have learned a strategy that gets them a valuable food resource, and food is essential for all life. And that has outweighed any negative effects of being in smoke. I mean, we use fire to make our food safe to eat. Once we figured that out, we like took off as humans. That doesn't mean that sitting next to a bonfire is good for you. It just means that, like burning your meat is a good way to kill all the bad stuff that's in meat that you're about to eat.
Yeah, exactly. We do the same trade-off in many ways. I mean, fire kills a lot of humans every year. It doesn't keep us from using it.
Mm-hmm.
And so to a bird, if it leads to a marginal increase in reproductive success,
Mm-hmm.
it's worth the risk, right? Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, it sounds like you have plenty to keep you busy for quite some time in the future.
Oh yeah. Yes. So I hope to continue this work for a long time. It's actually really hard to find money in research,
Yeah, of course.
despite being at two like really phenomenal institutions that are very well funded. There's just so many good ideas and there's limited money. So my postdoc does end in May. So if any of you stumble across other opportunities to fund this work, cool grants or scholarships, you let me know. But I am actively applying for money from a few different federal agencies to see if we can keep this going. And certainly Project Phoenix will continue with the support we've lined up at the museum. And we want to at least collect 5 years of data. but we have enough at the end of this year to get folks some cool preliminary results, which I'm really looking forward to.
Very good. Does anyone else have a question? If not, I think we are finished with tonight's presentation. I want to thank you very much again, Dr. Sanderfoot. A really interesting and sounds like groundbreaking area of research.
Thank you so much. If anybody has
Thank
any
you.
other questions or ideas, feel free to email me. All of my work is based on observations from birders, all of it. So I welcome and encourage you to email me. I also have a form on my website where you can let me know if you've seen something interesting when it's smoky, whether it's a bird that you've never seen before or no birds at all, like whatever you see, that's of value. So feel free to be in touch, and we will definitely keep our Project Phoenix volunteers informed. And if you're not already involved, I hope this inspired you to sign up. If not this year, because I get it, there's only a few weeks left. Next year would be great.
Right. Fire season, yeah, hopefully at least is winding down, and it wasn't much of a fire year here, which is good.
Yeah.
So
I'm glad
yeah,
you
we
guys are
can
great.
probably get back in touch next year in, the early part of the summer, and just remind everybody that this is a great opportunity to contribute to a developing area of science.
Thank you.
Can you share your website real quick before we?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so my website is ovsanderfoot.com. And then you can also learn more about Project Phoenix at projectphoenix.study. My website has a section on our different publications. So all of the open access ones you should be able to get to. And I think all of the recent publications that we came out with this summer are currently available, even if they're not always going to be open access. I'll just say very briefly, one study this summer shows differences in soundscapes, so like the acoustic environment of places before and after smoke events in Washington, possibly due to changes in birdsong. And the other was led by one of my phenomenal undergraduate students, Anna Nihei, and she found that bird body mass declines with repeated smoke exposure, and that capture rates of birds generally they shift as a result of smoke pollution. So that's really interesting, and that paper is available now too.
Awesome. Very good.
Fantastic. Thanks for all your hard work.
Thanks for your interest.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us tonight.
See you all later. Happy birding.